Contention 1 is trade-off. Despite Trump's efforts, renewables are booming. Rammer 25 finds that Trump couldn't kill the green transition. Breakthroughs leading curves and plummeting costs have made clean energy cheaper than fossil fuels. Its momentum is being driven by markets. Texas leads the U.S. in renewables, with prices low in the U.S. and oil and gas output already at record levels. Production will struggle to rise regardless of what Trump does. Thus, Cozy 23 finds that tripling renewable capacity by 2030 is vital to the 1.5-degree goal. Renewables would avoid 7 billion tons of CO2 emissions. The world has made huge strides in expanding renewable capacity in recent years. However, affirming trade-off Climate Action Network 424 continues that nuclear power acts as a significant hurdle to renewables. Nuclear diverts critical attention from existing sustainable solutions. Italy is investigating future nuclear power while delaying quitting coal by 4 years by investing 2 billion euros in wind and photovoltaic panels. It'd be possible to avoid 4 times more emissions than investing the same amount in 6 nuclear reactors. Bridge structures designed for nuclear power make it more challenging, time-consuming, and costly to introduce renewable power. In Romania, reactors have reserved grid capacity for years, blocking renewable energy projects. Renewables were blocked from connecting to the grid in Japan. As the government considered restarting reactors, Japan still heavily relies on fossil fuels. That historically increases emissions. Jacobson 24 finds that existing plants, due to continuous mining, refining of uranium, water vapor, and heat, China's investment in nuclear plants instead of wind or solar resulted in CO2 emissions increasing 1.3% rather than declining 3%. The resulting difference caused 69,000 air pollution deaths in China in 2016 alone. Aside from air pollution, Casella 23 continues. For every 0.1 degree of warming, the world could suffer 100 million deaths. Contention 2 is energy. Nuclear energy drives up prices. Goes 22 rise in routine costs make nuclear power economically uncompetitive with wind, solar, and gas. Generating nuclear energy range from 112 to 189 per megawatt hour, while solar costs between 36 and 44. Reactors and subsidized high construction costs make them uneconomical. In Georgia, reactors are years behind schedule and cost more than twice their original budget. For example, Second 24 rise in Georgia, the cost is being passed on to consumers. Residents receiving an increase of $21 in their monthly bills. In New York, the first RI 21 finds that plants receive millions of subsidy payments. That's an upward of 1.6 million per day, which shows up on ratepayers' bills. New York residents pay among the highest rates for electricity in the U.S. Rising electricity prices are deadly. Brittle 23 quantifies that a rise in but 10 cents per kilowatt increase of weekly mortality rate of 2.2%, 68,000 deaths will lead to higher energy prices. They also cause poverty. Guan 23 concludes, under cost of living pressures, an additional 141 million people will be pushed in extreme poverty. Contention 3 is proliferation. International demand for nuclear energy is low. WNR 25 contextualizes, there are no more reactors under construction in the U.S. The last reactor started during the past year. Almost half of reactors are under construction in China. Abroad, 93% are implemented in the nuclear weapon states. That's because Chinese and Russian reactors come with debt traps. Graham 20 furthers, Russia and China offer a disadvantageous debt relationship. Agreements with the U.S. relations. U.S. tech remains far more trusted. That means affirming will be the only way more countries get nuclear energy. Unfortunately, that'll open the door to proliferation. Galinsky 14 warns that countries falsely claim peaceful programs and later use their facilities for bombs in India, North Korea, and Pakistan. If tens of nations try to balance their deterrent equations, deterrence calculations become impossibly complicated. Today, all non-weapon states are members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and one of these countries should decide to obtain weapons, it would have to withdraw or cheat. Both courses risking a military response. Nuclear power is necessary to deal with climate change only if there are very many of them. Experts say it would take over 1,000 plants and dozens of more countries. Under Trump, the U.S. won't implement necessary safeguards. Galinsky 20 furthers, enthusiasts say if we sell with looser terms, we'll have more influence. They eye Saudi Arabia. Don't pay attention to the statement that if Iran get a bomb, you get one too. Trump opposes tightening security. Unchecked proliferation risks war. Symbolic 23 writes that the spread of nuclear weapons poses 2 threats to security. The first is deliberate first strike in fear of attack or preventative war. The second is accidental use due to malfunction. This preventative war is historically proven. CFR 22 concludes that U.S. forces invaded Iraq to destroy weapons of mass destruction. There have been over 100,000 civilians killed.
We affirm the resolution. The U.S. is facing an unprecedented energy crisis driven by bureaucratic opposition to nuclear energy. Matley 25 explains that 50 years ago, America was grappling with an unprecedented energy crisis, and oil embargo created fuel shortages. Today, it's a different kind of crisis. Analysts are forecasting America's electricity needs to double. A single new chip factory will require as much power as New Hampshire and Vermont combined. Companies are trying to work around by connecting nuclear power, a tactic that was dealt a heavy blow when this idea was blocked by regulators. Thus, our sole contention is preventing an energy emergency. Subpoint A is energy poverty, as nuclear energy is necessary to expand energy generation. Matthew 22 writes that nuclear plants provide continuous energy. Reactors can meet baseload power and operate flexibly to accommodate renewables. Renewables are not able to meet demands due to the intermittent nature of solar and wind and the absence of storage capacities. Nuclear can provide stability to grids, and smart grids would help smooth the transition to renewables. Moreover, repurposing existing energy infrastructure makes nuclear the cheapest option. As Aff Summary and Al24 writes, that a report highlighted the capacity of technology to repurpose retired coal plants while ensuring economic stability. In Poland, it demonstrated the benefits of replacing it with a nuclear reactor and addressed the challenges of decommissioning. history proves, as Quist and Brooks 15 writes, that empirical data from the Swedish and French shows that Sweden more than doubled its GDP while reducing emissions through a rapid expansion of nuclear. Once commercial power was brought online, emissions started to decline rapidly, slashed by 75%. Electricity prices were among the lowest in the world, and in the same time period, total electricity consumption doubled. Energy poverty would be devastating. As Battle and Al24 writes, that 1 in 3 households in the US report experiencing energy poverty, and living in energy poverty has direct impacts on increased mortality, having reduced basic necessities. Poverty kills. Merez23 quantifies that poverty is the 4th greatest cause of death. It was associated with 183,000 in 2019 and killed 10 times as many people as all homicides. Subpoint B is clean energy. U.S. emissions are increasing. Longperiod 25 explains that the U.S. is not on track to meet its Paris Agreement target of a 66% reduction. And Sprat 24 continues that current climate models downplay nonlinear processes such as the loss of carbon stores. A clear majority of scientists, 82%, expect to see catastrophic impacts of climate change. Fortunately, nuclear energy reduces emissions and outperforms alternatives. Stafford 22 explains that nuclear's land use is 100 times lower than solar and 1,000 times lower than wind, winning over local opposition. Reusing design, licensing, and construction to repeat installation would go a long way to lowering costs. We need a 4-fold increase in electricity for decarbonization. Which is why Al-Ghamdi and Al24 quantifies that for all G20 countries, a 1% increase in nuclear energy consumption would reduce emissions by 5.5%. Moreover, U.S. emissions are necessary to global reductions, which is why David Brown, Director of Energy Transition Practice at the London School of Economics, writes in 2024, the U.S. is the key to lowering global emissions. The U.S. will reach 30% of the global carbon capacity, and fossil fuel demand would peak 10 years later. Climate change is devastating. For every 0.1 degree rise in temperatures, it would kill 100 million. As Casella 23 continues, that for every 0.1 Celsius degrees of warming, the world could suffer 100 million deaths. Abnormal temperatures already claim as many 5 million lives a year, and the global effects of climate change are manifold. Moreover, their own evidence agrees with us. Their cozy evidence says, quote, more progress is needed and it rests on the world's ability to triple renewable energy. The status quo is not working and should vote with history, so affirm.
So on energy poverty, you say that it's necessary to expand clean energy. Why is it cheap?
Sure, it's cheap because our evidence says, 1, the US will need twice as much energy as it does today in 20 years, which means energy prices are going to rise. Second, your evidence, all of your examples about like South Carolina and New York, they're about the short-term construction costs. Over the long term, nuclear energy is the most reliable, so it prevents blackouts, and it also is the cheapest. For example, things like solar and wind only produce energy when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. Nuclear energy doesn't suffer from those problems.
Okay, but construction is a very expensive process that gets thrown to the taxes of people and increased tax prices by over 20.
Your evidence says that, quote, people in New York would pay $3 more per payment, which is $36 because of construction. Comparing that to the 50 years of uninterrupted generation, it is a very clean trade-off. I'll take a question.
Sure.
So let's go to your example. Let's go to your contention 3 on proliferation.
Mm-hmm. So,
who is going to proliferate if the U.S. develops nuclear energy?
Yeah. So our allies, for example, like Saudi Arabia, Iran. Or not Iran, Saudi Arabia because of Iran, countries like India.
Sure. Okay, that's great. So your impact says, quote, we would invade other countries because they might have WMDs like Iraq. So you're saying after the U.S. exports nuclear energy to our allies, we're going to invade them because they built nuclear weapons?
No, not Iraq. It's just like we invade countries in fear of security threats happening.
So we're going to invade the countries who we basically just handed a free check to get nukes for. We're going to invade our allies.
If they proliferate and we think there's going to be war, yes, intervention is likely.
So we're going to invade our NATO allies and we're going to turn against 80 years of history in Saudi
Didn't say
Arabia.
NATO once. We did not say NATO once.
Okay, so we're going to invade Saudi Arabia because we gave them a nuclear reactor and then they did something that was predictable with it.
What predictable? Who said it was predictable? They proliferated. Yes, we would invade because we're irrational and we think that they would use the nukes on another country or destabilize the region, or another country would attack, in which we place military there and that causes a war.
Sure, you can have a question.
Okay, so on your argument regarding clean energy, you say renewables have blackouts. How does that disprove the idea of solving like climate change, for example?
That's just one example. Our evidence says that renewables would take 1,000 times land, which means going through 1,000 times the amount of regulatory burdens, costs, would be much harder, and it's impossible. Moreover, again, remember, if renewables are intermittent, if they only produce energy when the weather is going good, it means they're not a reliable source. It means they can't solve things like continued energy needs, like oil can.
Why do they need like continued energy like during the night when they cannot produce enough energy during the day to sustain through the night? That's the point of solar energy.
Like energy demands change a lot of the time. We can't only produce energy during the day. It's the same reason why we use so much oil right now compared to renewables, because oil can be used for 24 hours straight, whereas it takes so much more infrastructure to build enough storage to be able to like store 12 hours of sunlight for 12 hours to use at night.
Overview. Nuclear energy fails. First, there's no fuel. Patel 24. All reactors require high enrichment fuel, for which we don't have. There is no market. Fuel requires new facilities that don't exist. Remember, affirming only increases investment in nuclear. It doesn't materially build the plants. Second, time. Jacobson 24. Time between planning and operation of a reactor includes identify site, lease land, obtain financing and insurance, install transmission, negotiate a power purchase agreement, obtains permits, build the plant, obtain a license. PTO is 19 years. Third, red tape. Crownhart 23 writes that nuclear have its own regulatory agency. Extra oversight means no detail goes unnoticed. It takes a while to get projects moving. NuScale started working towards regulatory approval in 2008. 2020 is when it received approval. Regulatory process cost $500 million and 2 million pages of documents. Fourth, cancellations. Bernardi 23. More nuclear capacity has been canceled than has ever come online or is slated to come online. Canceled plans follow a trend worldwide. GNPT tracks canceled, other data do not offer. Fifth, time lag. Jacobson 21. One plant takes 14 years to build, 7.1 million die from air pollution each year, so switching result in 93 million people dying. Solar only takes 2 years. Sixth, emissions increase. Jacobson 21. We read this evidence in case, and it indicates that China's investment actually led to an increase in emissions. Seventh, demand. They need backup. Jacobson 21. Advocates claim nuclear needed because renewables are intermittent and need natural gas. However, nuclear never matches power demand, so it needs backup. In France, with advanced programs, they need gas to meet peaks in demand. 8, upkeep. Investments only once, but Jacobson 21 writes that plants are so costly that owners demand subsidies. Subsidizing increases carbon emissions and costs relative to replacing the plants with wind and solar. 9th, laundry list. Delays, costs, unreliability, and weather. Can 24 writes that nuclear energy is plagued with delays coupled with an untrained workforce. Plants take 20 years for construction. UK's reactor announced in 2007 delayed several times, now 2031. British facility skyrocket to 53 billion, twice as much as scheduled. Cost with storing waste is undervalued. SMRs are riddled with the same limitations and are untested. SMR planned in the US was terminated due to rising costs. Nuclear power is proven unreliable. Future climatic conditions increase disconnections. On average, reactors had 152 days with zero production. 98% didn't have power for at least part of the day. Finally, their argument about coal plants takes longer than the Aff. As Conference 23 writes, coal timeline, complex site remediation significantly impacts the timeline, and it takes decades. Now their argument about energy poverty. Nuclear drives up energy bills. Gosh of Cambridge finds nuclear costs nearly $189 per megawatt hour, while solar and wind average just $30 to $50. Reactors cost more than twice their original budget. In Georgia, Statsequa of SBS reports using nuclear raised bills 10% or $21 monthly. Mark Cooper explains, nuclear construction costs are high and reactors need maintenance, which is exacerbated by the complexity of making tech safe. Thus, the government issues massive subsidies on nuclear that get passed on to ordinary Americans in the form of taxes, but nuclear power still can't compete in a free market. Now I'll respond to their arguments about renewables failing. 1, renewables don't fail. They just say it would create blackouts, but wind operates 24/7. Hydropower and geothermal both do too. Solar and wind are not the only renewables that we've read arguments that the transition is broadly working. Second, they talk about land, but even if it requires more land, there's no reason why we need to expand the land because renewables are working now. Third, they say it can work alongside nuclear, but our evidence says it distracts attention away from renewable energy and empirically crowds out the grid. Now specifically on their argument about warming. First, renewables are solving the problem effectively. Remember our Bremer and Causey cards from Case. Solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuels now, and they're on track to solve the warming crisis, but affirming disrupts progress. First, announcing major climate policies causes oil prices to plummet, undermining climate policy, as Baltix analyzes that it signals to producers that oil demand will plunge, motivating them to flood the market with cheap oil while it's still worth something.
Those who do not follow history are doomed to repeat it. That is what they have done with the first 10 responses they've given you without analyzing one actual country.
For example, they say we never had any fuel. Again, look to Poland. We obviously did because we saw an increase in GDP and a decrease in emissions. Moreover, we can build new reactors, which obviously solves this no fuel argument. Second thing to say is there's no time. Again, it's about retrofitting and transferring old coal plants into new ones, as we did in Poland, and what we're going to do right now with the Aff. Third thing to say is there's going to be red tape. Again, their own case says that we're decreasing regulations right now. This obviously makes no sense. It's an inherent contradiction. They don't even know what they're arguing for. The fourth thing to say is there's cancellations. Again, the only argument is that we don't have money right now. The affirmative does that. It gives investors an opportunity to invest in nuclear reactors, and it means that there's no cancellations because there's an actual incentive to do the Aff. The fifth thing they say is that it takes time. Again, I already brought this point up and how it's not going to take time. In fact, we're only going to solve. This argument is not true about how China saw it like the opposite. Again, why is China applicable to the US, whereas we've said that Sweden, Poland, all of them are. Now, they also say that we're going to see an increase in trade-off. Again, that was just responded to. They say there's going to be an increase in demand. Again, Poland disproves this. And again, upkeep argument, that does not matter. We're spurring a follow-on when other countries follow, so it's obviously no upkeep. Then they say it caused a laundry list. Again, empirically disproven with Poland. They have not analyzed history. And they say this takes longer. Again, Poland is much better on the evidence. It's also more recent. It's a meta-analysis. Now, let's talk about let's talk about the arguments that they gave on RC1. First thing to say is nuclear energy drops the cost. Again, this is not true. They cherry-picked one example. I've given you other countries which disprove this claim, but also we're building on existing costs, so there's no construction costs, which applies to their second response. They say renewables don't fail, and that there's also renewables are working right now. They've missed the mark. We have indicted their cost evidence. Specifically, the title of the article is that we need to triple our energy right now because renewables are missing the mark. Ask yourself, have they really presented you qualified evidence? No, they haven't. They also say we're crowded efforts right now. Again, that's not true. Renewables are ineffective in the first place, and you need the affirmative to enable as well. Then they also say that oil prices would deck demand. Again, Poland disproves this, but it's also in the short term. We're obviously going to solve that later on their case. Renewables, one, and remember any claims they make are just not cohesive with their evidence. The cost evidence specifically says we need to triple right now. But secondly, renewable energy is failing right now. Their evidence fails to account for new policy. Almert 25, Trump policy shifts underrolled back incentives, which played a key role in supporting the industry's expansion. Solar deployment would decline by 190 gigawatts. Also, Storage 25 explains global greenhouse gas emissions from energy hit a new high in 2025. Obviously, renewables aren't doing anything. Thirdly, renewables on their own aren't enough to succeed. You need the affirmative. Brooke et al. 14. The energy sources popularly known as renewables, inherently intermittent, dependent on backup power. Nuclear fission energy will solve. 124 continues. That plants operate at a full capacity more than 90% of the time. That's 3.5 times more reliable than wind or solar. Now, let's talk about their energy price argument. It is ahistorical. Firstly, remember, prices are unaffordable right now. 1/3 of people are already in energy poverty. Ask yourself, do you want to maintain the negative world? The answer is obviously no. Secondly, nuclear energy is more cost efficient than renewables, or in rolling 24. Despite its high upfront capital costs, nuclear is cheaper. Building excess wind, solar, and battery storage capacity was necessary to keep the lights on during periods. Remember, this analysis is simple. Nuclear requires one plant, but the renewables that they advocate for require multiple things like storage. But secondly, we will build on existing sources, as I already talked about. But thirdly, their RI evidence concedes that historically prices went up almost $3 per payment, which is equivalent to $36 a year. But fourthly, renewables can't be land use anymore. It's more expensive, and obviously you should prefer the affirmative. Now, let's talk about proliferation. One, this argument should not be evaluated at its face value. Russia, China export weapons all the time, and empirically over a dozen countries have never proliferated before during the Cold War. No impact. Secondly, it's illogical. We would invade our allies because we gave them a nuclear reactor. That makes no sense. Thirdly, we wouldn't invade because a country has WMDs. Lawmakers know the Iraq War was unpopular, so obviously there's no reason to start a war. But fourthly, proliferation is happening in the status quo right now. Zamora 25 explains, Trump's undermining confidence in his own allies, fueling trust in U.S. deterrence is deeply shaken. Ask yourself, the negative world does not provide you why you should keep that status quo. We ask you to change it. Now, absent the Aff, China would export anyway, introducing a net worse form of proliferation. Janet 23 explains, the U.S. considered a leader on nuclear safety, as U.S. and nuclear energy has waned as soon as the influence of the U.S., China is attracting potential nuclear deals by adhering to strict standards. They themselves outline countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq. We're not saying that they're never going to nuclear weapons. All they're going to do is just shift to China, use those weapons. And that's infinitely worse because China has worse safeguards on their exports. The U.S. will always be better because they're a democracy. It's pretty simple. Don't maintain the status quo.
All right, let's talk about your case. So you said the word Poland like 15 times in your speech. What warrants in your speech did you give for why Poland is more applicable than our example?
Sure, you're given China. China has various other economic circumstances that change the way they function their economy.
Like
Poland is an ally of the U.S.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I quite literally said that China is a much different example.
Okay, but I'm just saying, like, our evidence analyzes China before and after they had nuclear energy. I just want you to point out the flaw in that study and why it doesn't apply to Poland, or like why Poland is some sort of like magic.
Sure, we can both be correct. It's a matter of what's most applicable to the judge right now and what they should vote for in the world of the United States. Who's more reliable? Seeing China as someone who can model the U.S.? No, Poland is an ally. We rely on the same exports, same allies. We conduct diplomacy the same way. Obviously, we have the same sort of interconnectedness, which means that Poland's a better example.
Okay, this is like saying interconnectedness is a reason why empirics about nuclear energy is more applicable is honestly ridiculous.
We can get to it later. Contested in the speech. Not time for it tonight. Let's talk about the argument about
energy prices. Did energy prices increase in Poland?
I don't know. It's your example. Like, why would I know your example?
In what countries did energy prices increase?
In the United States. That's what our evidence is
Okay.
specific to.
Can you read that line? And then the date that was taken from, I guess, or like what that study, the methodology for that study, actually.
The methodology for that study. Look,
Yeah.
I just read you my evidence. Can you tell me the methodology for your Poland study?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, first, can you do that for me, and I'll do that for you. Like I promise. Even if it goes over time, I'll give you the methodology.
We're not going over cross time for this.
Okay, can you give me the methodology?
Yeah,
just
sure.
answer my question.
Right here in Georgia, the cost is being passed on to consumers.
I don't wanna lie, I want the
Residents
methodology
received
for
an
the study.
increase in 20. Dude, like they studied the amount of money that these Georgians
I studied
paid.
history. That does not mean I'm a scholar in history all of a sudden. What makes your author credible?
Dude,
How do you
this
make the
is
defense?
like I have read evidence from a study that surveyed how Georgians' energy bills were affected
Again,
by nuclear
If
energy.
I studied biology, doesn't make me an expert in school, right? What was your study? Did it conduct like over, how many decades was it? What did they analyze? That's the methodology.
Sure, you can pull up the methodology.
Thank you.
Sure. While you're doing that, can I ask you a question?
I mean, I'd like to get this first. I don't want to go, because I don't want to go over time. This is important.
So they just analyzed the bills of the people in Georgia.
So
I don't know
how
what
did
you
they
want
do
me
that?
to say. They
How did
probably
they-
took a survey of their power bill.
So a survey of one town is applicable to, or I guess it's supposed to be better than
Okay,
Poland,
for example, yes, because yours is about Poland, ours is about real nuclear reactors in the United States. If you want to make this a debate about applicability, we should probably talk about the nuclear reactors which already exist within the United States, which drove up prices, which is a far better example than
So
Poland.
you're going to contest around that one town in Georgia is a better example than Poland?
Yes, because it is about the United States and it is far more specific. You made this debate about applicability, not me, and now you're getting upset that we have evidence that's more
I'm not
applicable.
being upset.
Order is going to be the Neg, then the Aff. The easiest place to vote is our first argument on renewable trade-off. Currently, renewable energy is surging in demand, reducing 7 billion tons of emissions by 2030. However, Affirmative trades out for more sustainable solutions by diverting funding and making the grid incompatible with renewables. That's terrible. Nuclear energy historically caused 69,000 extra deaths per year due to mining and thermal pollution. They say nuclear energy is better. First, this is incorrect. Our evidence looks at the only example of widespread adoption of nuclear energy and finds that it increased deaths by 69,000 per year because of continuous uranium mining, which is required to fuel the plant. This is the only warrant read and given in the round. They just asserted Poland without explaining why. Secondly, their evidence doesn't analyze the alternative. It costs 52 billion euros to build only 6 nuclear plants, but that same money can build hundreds of more renewables much, much quicker. They say that it's not scalable and that it's not intermittent, but this makes no sense. We have said specifically geothermal and hydropower can operate 24 hours a day, which means that people can get the energy they constantly need and it's continuous. The last thing they say is we need to triple renewables. We agree. Our evidence says that renewable prices are dropping every single year and that renewables are increasing, which means that this will be relevant on their case, but we are on track to solve climate change. They say it causes proliferation on their third argument, but they've conceded that Trump doesn't care about safeguards when exporting nuclear reactors, so proliferation will happen regardless. Here's why you should prefer our argument on climate change. It's the biggest impact. It's 150 million lives for every 0.1 degree of warming, and it increases the chances for resource conflicts from countries as countries need to survive, so they'll go invade other countries to get more resources as they start plummeting their supply, which means it's more likely to cause conflict, which is another external scenario that turns their argument. Let's start on their case now. We'll go for the time frame argument. Even if nuclear is a better sounding solution, even if it was some magical unicorn that solved all of Poland's problems, they have not contested our argument that it comes far too late. Our evidence indicates that the process of construction is ridiculously long. Leasing, financing, negotiation, permits, and construction takes 19 years. Their only response is about how we can repurpose coal plants, but they have conceded the only evidence that actually writes about how long coal plants repurposing would take, and it would take decades. It answers their evidence, and it proves. They themselves say we need to triple clean energy by 2030, but they're the only ones that prevent that from happening. They've conceded that it distracts attention away from renewables, so they just kill the only chance of solving climate change. Secondly, they've conceded the green paradox argument. Investment into nuclear energy causes investors to shift priorities to nuclear energy, causing them to rapidly sell off oil at cheaper prices because they don't think it'll be profitable, which causes people to buy cheap and dirty oil as investors sell cheaper oil. This means that climate change cannot get solved because there will be too many people using oil as a result of high construction costs, negating any benefit to the app. Their long-term solvency is irrelevant. If climate change is already decked in the short term, then we can't solve it or reverse it when hundreds of millions of people will die as a result of nuclear energy. On their argument about energy prices, they just say Poland, but they've conceded the construction of nuclear plants costs so much money that it rises prices and would encourage people to buy cheaper oil, negating any benefit to their argument.
The order will be the Aff case, Flay, and then the Neg case. Both sides agree that climate change is the most important issue, but there are two numbers that should trigger your ballot. First is that 82% of scientists expect warming to increase. This analyzes their evidence. It says, sure, renewables might be working, emissions might be on track to decline, but the long prior evidence from just this year says we aren't doing it fast enough, irregardless of renewable innovation. The second number they have completely missed is that renewables take 1,000 times the land. It does not matter how cheaper they are when our Stafford evidence says it's physically impossible to get 1,000 times the land because it will A, cost more, B, require environmental permitting across 1,000 times the magnitude, all of which mean that even renewables work in a vacuum, they do not work when you actually look at the numbers. That means it's very clean to vote our contention to about protecting the climate. Remember, emissions are increasing, but the affirmative solves this because A, you're able to reduce mining from renewable minerals, you're able to produce clean energy, and you're able to reduce land use. Why does this matter? We both agree it kills hundreds of millions of people. They've given you two responses. Fundamentally, they just said it takes too long. But the problem is, this is about them building reactors from the ground up. Remember, if you look at what's actually being proposed right now, it would build on existing fossil fuel infrastructure, saving us decades on construction costs and time. Moreover, if you look at history in places like Sweden, France, and Poland, this is empirically what happened, which means you should break the tie in history. The next argument they tell you is about the green paradox. They dropped a response. One, this is ahistorical. We've never done this in any of the other countries. And our Algandi evidence, which is a meta-analysis from 2000 to 2021, analyzing all G20 countries, tells you that a 1% increase in nuclear emissions 1% increase in nuclear energy decreased emissions by 5%. This is the best study that was read in the round, and it analyzed all the G20 countries up to 2021, well with history there. But moreover, at best, the green paradox argument about oil shortage is short-term. For example, oil companies would only have so much oil to give out in the short term before they're put out of business by a cleaner form of energy, which means we've lost insolvency. Here's the way, which they did none of. If you analyze history, which we've 20 years of, and across all G20 countries, nuclear energy empirically works, whereas they've given you one-off solutions from think tanks with no numbers or history to back them up. Hang your hat with history, vote affirmative. If anything, you know emissions are increasing. Let's go to their case. The problem is they've not responded to the fact that even though emissions might be decreasing, it's not decreasing by fast enough, which is why their own cozy evidence says we need to do much more to triple our renewable demand. And our evidence on our case says that the U.S. cannot meet a twofold increase in electricity demand from things like new manufacturing. For example, one new computer chip factory will cost as much energy as Vermont and New Hampshire, which is something renewables cannot fill. The second argument you should remember is that renewables are decreasing right now. Our evidence is from this year and analyzes the most recent policy trends and says in the U.S. renewable capacity is expected to decrease because Trump will do things like roll back tax credits and consumers don't want it. Lastly, remember, if we can never build renewables because it takes 1,000 times the land, it means their argument is unfeasible. Moreover, remember, renewables do not rely on the weather, so they produce energy consistently. Their only response is you can rely on hydropower and geopower. But if you look at history, this has never worked, and you should vote with history.
Okay, so you say that renewables are decreasing, but this is only predictive. We have read evidence that says, despite Trump's cuts on renewables, prices are still lower than ever, and they're increasing.
I'm going to read a quote from your cozy evidence, which you clearly did not highlight.
Okay, I can read you a quote
Wait,
from
before that,
evidence.
you also have made the claim that we should do long-term analysis. Well, we've done that for you. We've said that long-term analysis shows...
Well, yeah, ours is also long-term. It says Trump couldn't kill the green transition. Plummeting costs to make clean energy cheaper than fossil
That
fuels.
is predictive of what he did before office. Our evidence says now that Trump is already doing these things. For example, even if he has not passed congressional bills taking away things like the Inflation Reduction Act, he's already done things like slash EPA funding, all of which have a dramatic effect on our ability to actually go out.
Making this distinction between predictive and not predictive is like really crazy because your evidence is also predictive of the effects of what Trump will do, which is literally the exact same thing our card is doing. Trump has done things, yes, our evidence is predicting, just like yours is, the outcome of what Trump has done.
You think you're not understanding our point.
Okay, first, our evidence is more recent than yours, which is why we read it. But moreover, your cozy evidence, which you staked around on, says, quote, more progress is needed.
Never stake the round on this?
No.
Never stake the round on this, but it says we are on that path. The first card literally says we are on that path as renewable prices are decreasing a lot before fossil fuels and production is increasing, which is proof that demand...
Our argument was that was never enough, which is why your cozy evidence concludes that more progress is needed to rest on the world.
Okay, can you read me a card? Can you read me a card that says it's not? And like we are...
Okay, your cozy evidence, which we sent to...
Okay, yeah, I understand, but we have read evidence that it's going to increase.
Okay, but the problem is your cozy policy evidence says, sure, it might be increasing, sure, renewable prices might be declining, but the end conclusion, which we sent in the email chain, says, yet more progress is needed, as the IEA's net zero roadmap laid out since 2021, achieving net zero emissions from the energy sector by 2050 rests on the world's ability to triple renewable energy. It says we need to do this despite the fact that emissions are, it's like making a claim that, sure, and we might be doing something, but we need to do more. You can take a question, or we'll take a question.
We've also outlined climate change accelerating, it's increasing, only will it solve that energy problem. We'll take a question.
Sure.
Let's talk about this argument.
Yeah, sure. Let's go to your examples, like your one, sure, let's go to your examples. So your China example, which is like the only like historical piece of evidence you read about emissions, says emissions increased by 1.3% over the course of 2 years. What about that makes it a reliable study to predict long-term trends?
Yeah, China is the biggest country scale in comparison to the US, even actually probably more accurate.
Sorry, we're asking about long-term trends because you cited 2 years.
This is long. Our evidence says because of constant uranium mining as a result of running plants, it requires more mining. But this is long term. You have to continuously mine uranium to fuel nuclear plants, which as a result creates emissions. None of this is short term.
Wait, so just to clarify, you don't think there's any other things in China that might make it a differential scenario? For example,
you have not contested that or said any of this before in the round, which means it's irrelevant. We have 12 seconds.
12. I'll just be clarifying the round starting on time frame stuff. If there's one argument that should probably make this round extremely easy to vote, it's the time frame argument. Even if nuclear is a better sounding solution, even if it was better in all G20 countries, they just have not responded to the argument that it comes far too late. The process of construction is ridiculously long. Leasing, financing, negotiation, permits, and construction takes 19 years. Their only response is about how we can repurpose coal plants. Call for our evidence after the round. It is the only evidence which actually tells you how long repurposing takes, and it says that it takes literally decades, and it does not happen fast enough. At that point, they can literally win their argument about how nuclear energy is the best thing in the world because our evidence, the graph inserted, indicates that it takes decades to do, which means that the solvency in the interim has to come first. The next argument we're going to go for is the green paradox. Investment into nuclear energy causes investors to shift priorities to nuclear energy, which causes the people to rapidly sell off oil because they think that the oil market is going to collapse. As a result, the oil prices will plummet and it'll become far cheaper to use oil than nuclear energy. They have a couple of responses. They say it's only in the short term, but they have conceded that short-term deficits in climate change affects long-term patterns. You cannot solve and you cannot undo the hundreds of thousands of tons of emissions that will happen as a result. They also say that it didn't happen in the past, but it's about large-scale policy. Now let's talk about our case. Currently, renewable energy is surging in demand, reducing 7 billion tons of emissions by 2030. However, Fermi trades off for more sustainable solutions by diverting funding and making the grid incompatible with renewables. That's terrible. Nuclear energy struggle causes 69,000 extra deaths per year due to mining and thermal pollution. Their only response is about how it's not fast enough. But remember, imperfections in the status quo is not an excuse to kill hundreds of millions of people as a result of increased pollutions in the short term. They have conceded our evidence, which indicates that renewables are increasing now. You don't want to vote on this 3 times renewable argument because that's just that's just to meet a 1.5 degree goal. But if we want that renewables are a net better solution, then vote Neg. Long-term solutions cannot exist if the climate is already ruined, and that's what you have to remember.
I'm going to start on the argument about climate, specifically ours, and I'll go into comparative both worlds, and I'll go into the renewables argument that they present. The first thing in our ballot is going to be probability. Have they given you one statistic in their last page? Absolutely not. I'm going to give you a bunch right now, which you should prefer. The biggest issue here is our claim is simple. Emissions are skyrocketing right now, and you're the only chance to reverse that. They have not provided you a solution for that. However, the affirmative does solve that. It replaces, it reduces using coal plants, and it means that we can transition to a clean energy, which is more sustainable. It does not rely on any fluctuations of demand for energy or grids. It means that we can sustainably solve climate change over the long term. As the US is one of the biggest global emitters, we can finally put an end to the amount of deaths that it causes each year. Both of us agree that it's devastating and you should prevent it. The only response they have is that it takes too long. Ask yourself, sure, maybe they're correct about building new nuclear power plants, but that's not the case. There's 2 issues with this argument. The first is that Poland obviously proves that this is not true. A 1% increase in nuclear energy consumption decreased emissions by 5%. That is a statistic. They can give you word after word, but if they're not giving you a number, I'm sorry, but you cannot vote on that. Second thing is that we're also repurposing old coal plants. Why does that require licensing, permitting? It simply does not. It happens immediately. Then, This oil argument is also just wrong. They say that it's not short term. Ask yourself why. Short term, sure, oil prices plummet. Long term, though, we adapt to that decrease in oil and we're able to sustainably solve climate change. Moreover, ask yourself, did we see oil prices decrease when we did it with Poland or even Japan or France or Sweden? Absolutely not. We have given you example after example. They've done none of that. Obviously, the debate is quite clear. Now, the argument that they have is simply, they've not done any comparative weighing in this entire speech. The biggest thing here is that we've given you 20 years of analysis with all the G20 countries, and all they've given you is one-off solutions. We've given you a litany of examples. It's pretty clear where you should vote. With that being said, let's go to their case. The biggest thing they say is that renewables would get traded off. Again, this might be true that renewables in a vacuum are good. It is a matter of feasibility. Can you implement them over 1,000 uses of land? Absolutely not. Which is why nuclear is the only feasible option. It reduces the amount of land that you need by 1,000 times. It means, even if they're correct, renewables are good. It does not matter because you cannot implement them on the scale that we need to solve climate change, which they have agreed is escalating right now. Look, it's such a simple debate. Climate change is escalating right now. We're the only side who's giving you a solution to that. We see it easy out now.